Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. If everyone could please take their seats, we are going to begin momentarily. Thank you so much. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. If you could please take your seats. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, and dignitaries. I would first like to begin by acknowledging the land on which we gather is the traditional unceded Algonquin territory. I see a few familiar faces in the audience here today. However, for those of you who do not know me, my name is Natasha Hope Morano, and I'm the former vice president of the Economic Club, but now proudly serve as a member of the Advisory Council. I would be remiss if I didn't take a moment to reflect upon the most recent events that happened here in Ottawa, with the extensive damage from the devastating tornado. Our hearts are certainly with those who have been severely impacted. Just earlier, I was speaking with a few of those individuals who are in the room today who were impacted by this. And I'd like to make an announcement that the Economic Club will certainly be playing a role in the recovery and making a donation along with all of the incredible organizations here in Ottawa that are helping the relief team. So please join me in giving the Economic Club a round of applause for this. I think there's still something like 50,000 people that don't have power, so thank you for all of you for coming today. Now, through the years, I've seen firsthand the work being done to shape and change the Economic Club into a forum, not just for a select few, but for this entire nation. Each year, the Economic Club hosts close to 100 events right across the nation, featuring discussions about the most pressing economic issues of our day, including AI, environmental sustainability, and innovation in healthcare. But we would not be able to bring these important discussions to the forum and be able to witness the impact of these discussions without our event sponsors. And I'd like to take a moment to thank the sponsors for today's session: Novo Nordisk Canada, Lundbeck Canada, Leo Pharma Inc., AstraZeneca, Roche, and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs Denmark. Please join me in giving them a hearty round of applause. Now, the Economic Club is proud to present today's discussion, Growing the Life Sciences Industry, Improving Access, Affordability, and Appropriate Use of Medicines. Can we have it all? That's the big question. But before I introduce our panelists and moderator, I would like to welcome a special guest to the podium, the newly appointed Danish ambassador to Canada, Mr. Thomas Winkler, who has spent the last 5 years as the Danish ambassador to Russia in Moscow. Ambassador Thomas Winkler, we're so happy to have you here today, and on that note, I'd like to welcome you to the podium.
Thank you. Thank you, and well, good morning, I suppose, still, good day. Very happy to be here, very happy to have been invited by the Economic Club of Canada to open this event on how to develop the life science industry. This, as you heard, is actually a first for me. I've been in Ottawa for 3 weeks, so this is my sort of first public performance in Canada, and I'm really happy to start with exactly this subject of developing life science industry. I'm of course also happy to be here because when you arrive as a Danish ambassador to Canada and you run around with all this diplomatic stuff for a few weeks, and you see that the relations between Denmark and Canada are incredibly strong. So I'm not only standing here talking about life science industry, I'm talking here representing a country which is working so closely with Canada in so many fields. And I'm only happy to see and to push for further cooperation in the life science industry. I can't help also because my staff keep telling me to remember to say that we, Canada and the Kingdom of Denmark are actually neighbors. I know what neighbor you keep talking about, and it's important, but you have Canada, other neighbors in the north, namely the Kingdom of Denmark. And with neighborhood, as you know, grows also cooperation and obligation. So I think that's a very important start for any event which includes Denmark and Canada. Of course, we also have to mention that we have the same values. In this world, which is, well, it depends on how diplomatic you want to be, disruptive, perhaps is one word. It's really important that we still have countries and nations who hold up the values as Denmark and Canada do together. And of course, trade, investment, developing new industries, research, joint common research is one very, very important way forward, not only between neighbors, but between nations. And this is not only the Danish ambassador stating that this is a very, very firm belief of my government and of my parliament, that it's through trade and investments and joint development, especially new industries, that we counter some of the volatile developments on this planet. Denmark is also, apart from being a neighbor to Canada, a member of the European Union, and I cannot help but start this part by mentioning CETA, the trade agreement between the EU and Canada. This is, in my view, an underestimated project. This is really a project, an agreement, which has led to an increase in growth and economic cooperation between the European Union and Canada. And one of the reasons why CETA is important is because it creates clear, firm framework conditions for businesses. And I will say that once more. Clear, foreseeable framework conditions for businesses. This is what CETA creates. That's what we have to strive to create in all areas of cooperation, but perhaps especially in the life science industries. Because this is not only, and I'm sorry to the businesses for saying this is not only about business. This is about developing acceptable social conditions for all. And therefore, it's exactly in the life science industries, these clear framework conditions are so important. And this is an area where Denmark, we strongly believe, have something to offer. We have a very, very strong pharmaceutical industry. It's our single largest export industry in Denmark. It has developed tremendously over the past years. And the reason why it's developed is because we have in Denmark created these framework conditions that makes it possible for the pharmaceutical industry to spend money on research and development for the future benefit of all. Without these framework conditions, that would not be possible. And I know, and again, I would apologize to the sponsors, the Danish sponsors. This is not only about large pharmaceutical companies. This industry, the innovation of this industry, creates a group of smaller and medium-sized industries behind them, which contributes to these new developments. So it's important that we create these perfect, foreseeable framework conditions. If we don't, we will not get this innovative industry to actually perform, so to speak, to develop the new products, to create work in a group of minor and medium-sized enterprises. So I'm really looking forward to hearing the discussions here today, to hear what we can contribute from the Danish side, our experiences in how to create this framework. Of course, I want to thank the Economic Club Canada for hosting this event. I must say, coming from Moscow, where sometimes these events were a bit more low-key, it's very, very impressive to be here and to see this way of organizing an event. So thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. I'm also looking forward to contributing myself, my embassy, my commercial experts, to promote this part of cooperation between the Kingdom of Denmark and Canada. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador. What a great way to start the afternoon, and let me officially welcome you to the nation's capital. Now, affordability of and access to innovative medicines are challenges that Canada and many other nations currently face. With healthcare budgets stretched due to rising drug prices and aging populations, the challenges just keep coming and coming and coming. Addressing these issues requires creative policy and market-based approaches that draw on the best ideas from around the world. And I'm pleased to welcome our expert panel today who will be discussing this very topic. Now, they will be taking questions from the audience, so I encourage all of you to cultivate those questions, and when cued, please ask away. So now I would like to officially get things started and call upon our panelists. Please take your seat as you're introduced. Our first panelist is Ms. Cheryl Groeneweg, Director General, Manufacturing and Life Sciences Branch, Innovation, Sciences, and Economic Development Canada. It's a bit of a tongue twister. Next, we have Hans-Erik Henriksen, CEO of Healthcare Denmark. Next, we have Brian Hilderdink, President, Novo Nordisk Canada, Inc. And leading our discussion today is Dr. Ilse Turnick, Executive Chair of Triphase Accelerator Corporation. In her previous role, Ilse served as the CEO of the Mars Discovery District from 2005 and 2017. Please join me in welcoming our distinguished panel to the stage.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much to the Economic Club for hosting this important discussion and for our panelists in joining us. So as you've heard and as we all know, these are extraordinary times, and the ambassador was polite, but if you're like me, some mornings we really wake up and feel that the world is a little bit off its axis. But these challenges are certainly also impacting healthcare. And healthcare systems everywhere are straining under the pressures of rising costs, comorbidity of aging populations. And at the same time, every day we encounter these extraordinary new innovations in life sciences affecting really almost every disease area. We also see, just as in other sectors, the digital transformation of the healthcare sector, starting with prevention, starting with research, and then, of course, into treatment and diagnosis, and even in how we manage our healthcare system. All of which is also contributing to citizens having different expectations of their encounters with the healthcare system. From an economic development perspective, certainly there is a huge global market pull, particularly from emerging markets, with a rising middle class expecting modern healthcare solutions, and that is becoming a huge opportunity, growth opportunity for countries, including Canada. All of this with our single-payer system, our incredibly strong scientific research foundations present both huge challenges and opportunities for Canada. And as the ambassador mentioned, so often we are stuck in looking south of the border when we think about these issues. And of course, the US remains a leading innovator, and for many of our young companies, even in its fragmented system, become the channel for which they can access the market. But when we think holistically, there are perhaps much better examples when we look to our strong partnerships and friendships in Europe. And today we have a really unique opportunity to take a bit of a deeper dive into the example in Denmark. And our goal is to really look forward and see what we can learn from these public-private partnerships, which are very uniquely executed in the European context. And frankly, when we look at the system, many of the foundations are much more comparable. So maybe let's start off by just sort of setting some context. How do we think about Canada versus Denmark and Scandinavia a little bit more broadly in terms of innovative health economy and access to innovative health therapies? Brian, can we get you started?
Yeah, thank you. I think first, just a little bit of context. So I head up Novo Nordisk Canada, which is the largest healthcare company coming out of Denmark. We produce about half the world's supply of insulin. And of course, insulin was discovered in Canada. So I think what could be germane to this discussion at some point is how is it that a Canadian discovery led to this big global multinational company that we're very proud of in Denmark, based on Canadian intellectual property. I've also had the opportunity to live and work in Denmark for many years. I'm Canadian, but spent 8 years living in Denmark over 2 different rotations. So I can look at it both from a kind of economic development standpoint and also look at the Danish system relative to the Canadian system as a patient. And I think what's interesting is that Denmark is a single-payer system where the majority of the population source their products through this single-payer system. And I know that we've been kind of grappling with what types of changes should we have here in Canada, and is that something that we should look at for inspiration? Now, I'm going to say something that is slightly maybe contradictory to the tone of the discussion, because I think that there's so many things that we can look to for Denmark for inspiration. I can tell you as a patient, having private insurance living in Canada, I actually had much more access to innovative drugs living here than I did in Denmark. Now, in Denmark, you don't have the same dilemma where people fall between the cracks as we do in the Canadian system. And I can also say that in Denmark, people are able to get access to what drugs are available on the formulary much quicker. The ambassador talked about a very transparent mechanism, and I think that there is very kind of transparent timelines in Denmark from when products are approved, when they're launched, and then when people get access to them. Not all drugs are necessarily going to be available, because that's one of the compromises that you make when you do have a single-payer system, is that you're not going to have access to all those drugs. I mean, I got to experience firsthand what it was like to pay cash out of pocket for drugs, something that I don't have to do due to my private insurance here in Canada. So I think what's, again, interesting in this discussion is so much focus on the Canadian healthcare system is talking about what is wrong with it. And I'd like to change that narrative to kind of say, well, let's start with what works. Mm-hmm. And for about half the population, we have a really high-functioning system when it comes to access to innovative drugs. For other individuals that need to access drugs through the public plan, that's where they need to wait many, many years behind a country like Denmark. And I think that maybe taking looking at that as a little bit of inspiration in terms of how we can maybe be a little more predictable here in Canada would be something that also helps from an investment perspective. And happy to come back and give some more perspective on that.
Hans-Erik?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of mutual challenges between Canada and Denmark when it comes to healthcare. And in Denmark, a little bit more than 10 years ago, actually, I think it was around 2002, we got a wake-up call because the demand on healthcare became so high that we had long waiting lists and the government had to do something. And since that time, there has been a focus on transforming Danish healthcare. In 1999, we had 98 hospitals in Denmark. Today, we have 32, and obviously that is because the realization was, hey, the solution to this challenge is not to just build new hospitals. We need to think about delivering healthcare in a different way. And therefore, the name of the game for the transformation is to push healthcare closer to the citizens, deliver more healthcare in the primary sector, deliver more healthcare outside the hospitals. And the industry is definitely a partner in making that happen, because the focus is on treatment, which is not a burden on the hospital, and in that respect, obviously, new and innovative medicine that can make that difference. That's a focus for the Danish authorities. If you look at our medicine expenses in Denmark, you will see that Denmark is the country that have the lowest expense level for generic medicine. That is because we have used our level of IT integration to introduce more competition and bi-weekly tenders, which run electronically for this kind of medicine. On the other hand, if you look at our total expenses for medicine, cost for medicine, you will see Denmark is not among the lowest countries, and that is because the other side of the equation and kind of the solution to the problem I talked about before, that is to carefully evaluate new medicine, introduce it to the markets as fast as possible if it can help make that difference to create treatments, cure that offload the hospitals. Public-private cooperation in Denmark goes a long way back. Actually, one of the first examples is the Steno Diabetes Hospital, which was established by Novo or Nordisk at that time, decades ago, and which proved to be so efficient handling diabetes patients that the public authorities said, hey, can we work together because we want to be able to work in partnership with you. And there are traces of that partnership going up from there in the future. You may know that in Denmark, all citizens have their own electronic health record. I can log on to an electronic health record. I can see my total health record, all my medicine, all my lab results, all my clinical notes. Few of you probably know that the industry had something to do with it, because the starting point of the Danish e-health portal was actually a gift from the Danish Pharmacy Association, a portal they had developed as the inspiration for creating what is now world famous today. To take one of the regions in Denmark, their shared care platform comes from the industry. So with those challenges, a decade ago leading to structural reform, fueling this transformation, more interest and further emphasis from Danish authorities in this cooperation with the industry has been introduced simply because it was apparent and evident that more cooperation with the industry is part of the solution to transforming Danish healthcare. And I can talk much more about that, but I think I'll pause it.
Yeah, great examples. Cheryl, so how do you think about the Canada versus Denmark or European examples when you try to benchmark some of the initiatives that the federal government's involved in?
That's a fantastic question. You know, as a longstanding policy person in the federal government, the orientation is always to look at what other countries are doing. How is that comparison to what we're doing here in Canada? Denmark certainly has come to the fore as one of the countries to watch in terms of the mechanisms that they have put in place and continue to strive towards to help them become world leaders in some dimensions and many, many dimensions of life sciences. At a certain point, though, that becomes an interesting exercise, but not necessarily fully applicable to Canada. So the Canadian system has to consider many factors that are not found elsewhere. Living in a confederacy is one of those things, and how the fathers of confederation decided on the division of roles and responsibilities has maybe both helped and complicated what we find ourselves in Canada. So from my perspective, setting innovation policy or ecosystem policies around the economics and maybe some of the social environmental decisions around the life sciences in Canada, I have to consider the multifaceted roles and responsibilities of every player in the system. And so what we find ourselves with, in particular when it comes to drugs, is we have every single province and territory having their own systems, their own data sets, their own rules and regulations about how that functions. And by the way, it doesn't stop there, because there are two federal systems where we have jurisdiction over some population of Canada, and that is Veterans Affairs and Indigenous peoples. So you multiply that over, and that's many countries in one federal system. So then how does one tackle this? Well, I would say the government has been extremely deliberate in terms of thinking through a way forward on such an area as life sciences, where in my view, I feel them making it a priority. They went through an enormous consultation and had many Canadians, including those who are CEOs of companies, large and small, et cetera, give them advice in terms of what the Canadian innovation ecosystem needs. And that includes on the life sciences. They set up an economic strategy table specifically in health and biosciences to help inform what it is they need to do. But in advance of that, they put forward a program called the Strategic Innovation Fund for over $1 billion, $1.26 billion. Supercluster program that is unlike anything else that happens in the world to help spur on a different level of collaboration and a new way of people behaving, acting together, sharing IP, discovering and creating new value. And they've also decided to consider how it is, and I'm going to pick up the big R word, regulations happen in Canada. This is one of the things they're actually thinking through differently. And while many of you here might know the story of one particular part of the life sciences equation being regulated, indeed there are many interesting ideas coming forward. For instance, how does one sandbox new discoveries or technologies when those who are regulating might not necessarily be experts in that area, and therefore are stymied at how to regulate those areas? So how is it that we can think through differently how regulations happen in Canada, in life sciences and in other areas where we can continue to pursue being on the forefront? We are also considering how data and AI factor into what it is we're doing. So as an agnostic platform technology, artificial intelligence or machine learning can be applied to any sector. In the context of health and life sciences, we've been trying to do some thinking around, again, the regulatory side, what needs to happen in terms of privacy, cybersecurity, sharing, et cetera, across all of these unique systems within Canada. And to do that in such a way that people are protected in terms of their information, but that innovation can be unleashed in a way that's accelerating discoveries. That is having some compositional factors in terms of cross-population of ideas. Some traditional life sciences sectors, actors being combined with people outside of life sciences, and seeing how that recombination effect can make a difference. So I'll just say one final thing, and then I'll stop talking for my turn. But for me, the advances in AI and what has happened in AI probably is one of the foundational pieces that will be one of the key elements in terms of how it is we can leverage going forward. And I think there are more discoveries to come. Material sciences could be another area. I don't think we're done yet in terms of thinking what we need to do, but certainly having conversations and understanding the pathways forward better will help the government make decisions that are pro-life sciences value creation and making Canada the place in which that happens.
Terrific. If we come back to the Denmark example, Hans-Erik, it's quite surprising given the size of Denmark, how strong a leader it is in terms of building its life sciences industry. What do you think are the key ingredients for that success, and what lessons can we draw and bring to Canada from that experience?
I think the key ingredients has very much to do with opening up for research, this public-private partnership where the industry have access to efficient research, but it has in many ways also to do with the general partnership between authorities and the industry. Based on the driving force to transform the healthcare system, we're seeing that unfolding. The steno-diabetes example I mentioned before, that has now expanded to the whole country. So all 5 healthcare regions in Denmark now have a steno-diabetes center, a cooperation between the Novo Nordisk Foundation, not the company, because all the Danish big healthcare companies, they're actually owned by foundations. A cooperation between that foundation and the Ministry of Health and the regions, with the purpose to reduce the prevalence of the diabetes, to strengthen research in diabetes, and to strengthen education. It's a multi-billion investment from the foundation, but it's actually controlled by the public authorities. Other examples are similar cooperation between Lundbeck Foundation and the authorities in psychiatry, and also Leo Pharma, and more indirect ways of cooperating is in terms of the innovation that comes from the industry. For instance, Coloplast Care and similar initiatives from Leo Pharma and Lundbeck and Novo aims at using IT to strengthen the relation to the patient. And that is actually supporting the initiatives in Denmark to build a stronger digital relation with the patients from the authorities' side, because these initiatives, they contribute to educating patients and also to empowering patients. And in fact, in December, it will be possible to directly attach initiatives from the industries into the government's IT initiatives and the eHealth portal. So that's good examples on how we use innovation that comes from the industry to support where we're going with the transformation of healthcare. And obviously, this view to introducing new medicine as fast as possible, it unfolds in new strategy for our medicine agency, the Danish FDA. They have a specific focus on quality and fast access to the market for new medicine, and the right medicine, so to say. It is tied to a new growth plan for life science, and then you think, well, that's about investing in growing the life science industry, but it's just as much an advantage for the public authorities, because with that growth plan, the medicine agency will get more resources. They will get resources to work with a risk-sharing model with the industry, which has allowed us to share the risk for new medicine. They will be more engaged in evaluating new medicine. So in Denmark, in a couple of years, when that growth plan has unfolded, the approval of new medicine will not just be, here's some new medicine, we need to approve it. It will be taken into account, is this medicine that make a decisive difference for the healthcare system? And then they will prioritize differently. Likewise, they will also get more scientific resources. So the Danish healthcare transformation in relation to the industry, it's about a focused cooperation from the authorities side and from the industry side to use innovation to accelerate the transformation of healthcare to solve the issues which most countries have in healthcare.
So very interesting parallels there to Canada, because the Danish system is not large in the global context, but it's very intentional in being an early adopter of new innovations generated at home to be a springboard for global markets. So very interesting. So Brian, from an industry perspective, What of the current and sort of up-and-coming initiatives do you think are getting in the way of us emulating that example? And how can we take some of these new collaboration models and apply them here?
I think it's really interesting when you hear about the Danish system, and it always starts off with taking a very kind of holistic approach. And we heard about the kind of streamlining with hospitals. We've heard about the public-private partnerships. We've heard about the different innovation funds. And then when you talk to Cheryl, she's going to tell you about all kinds of fantastic technology that's being developed in Canada and the future prospects of having these multinational companies be Canadian headquartered, which I think could be a dream for all of us, creating high paying jobs and being a real stimulus for our economy. Yet in the world we're in, when it talks to the regulation of drugs, we tend to work very much in silos. And right now there is pricing reform, which is about to be passed, which would be very, very not just detrimental for the innovative pharmaceutical companies that manufacture drugs, but detrimental from an investment standpoint and detrimental from an end user, from a patient standpoint. Right now, Canada enjoys what we refer to as being a Tier 1 launch country. That means that when innovative drugs are launched in the United States, they're launched in a handful of European countries and a jurisdiction like Japan. We also get to launch here in Canada. And the reason why we can launch in Canada is because there is access immediately, almost immediately, to half the market, to those with private insurance. And then there's a pathway, albeit it can take sometimes several years, to then expand that coverage to the public market, to people who source their drugs through something like Ontario Drug Benefit. Outside of all of that, however, there is a body called the Patent and Medicine Pricing Review Board, and what they do is regulate prices to ensure that no Canadian is subject to an excessive price for drugs that have a patent. Now, the pricing reform may appear to be a really good idea because if we can make drugs more affordable, if we can make them more accessible to more Canadians, that has to be a good thing. The challenge with these changes is we don't believe that it'll really work in terms of being able to make drugs more accessible. I think for those Canadians that are truly challenged to pay for their drugs, reducing prices by 10, 20, 30% isn't going to make a sufficient difference in their life. But what it will do is fundamentally change the way multinational companies approach a market that looks like 2% of the global pharma market. And similar to many markets around the world, Australia being an example of a cautionary tale, we could end up being a Tier 2 or Tier 3 launch country, meaning that we need to wait several years behind the rest of the world. That means several years before people who need access to innovative drugs get those drugs. It also means that the investment that comes along with being a Tier 1 launch country, which looks like clinical trials and collaborations with academic centers and different forms of research and development, will go to other markets and not to Canada. So I guess my advice in all of this to get more to a Danish setup is how do we take more of that holistic view? How do we understand what it is that we really want to accomplish from a national pharmacare standpoint? Because hopefully there's nobody in this room who thinks that any Canadian should go without access to innovative drugs, and we know that there are some people who do struggle. Let's figure that piece out. Let's also figure out what it's going to take to build these homegrown biotechnology companies that can be Canadian. What are some of the regulatory framework? What are some of the things that we can do to make Canada a more predictable market? And how do we encourage investment, not chase it away?
Well, we have to change the channel on that conversation, which often feels very combative, right? So Cheryl, it's been a busy couple of years at ISED. What are the 2 or 3 things that you think needs to happen in the next, 18 months or so to make sure that these initiatives both succeed, but particularly succeed to boost our life sciences and health sector?
Okay, so it's budget time, so everybody's thinking about that. And we have a government, of course, that's looking at an election. So there's a lot of urgency inside the government in terms of the public servants like me to give advice, as we are, supposed to do, to government of the day. Right now, we're looking at a couple of major shifts in innovation policy that have been launched but have not been fully realized. The Superclusters Initiative, as I said before, it is in some ways an experiment that has not happened anywhere else in the world, and perhaps it could be replicated, we'll see. The root of it is that we're trying to get businesses to collaborate differently with the academic and research groups, and so that the money comes, the talent comes, the R&D happens, and that leads to commercialization. The superclusters have really just figured out their governance models and have signed their agreements with the federal government. So the next 18 months, we'll see how those 5 superclusters are made manifest. And they will probably all be quite unique from each other, given the spaces in which they occupy. But it's how are those made real, and how do those realize something different for Canada to attract the capital that wants to stay, the homegrown IP, the ambitious small firms that want to grow to be billion-dollar firms, the companies that don't just see Canada as a market or the US as a market because we're so close, but those that want to see the globe as their ambition in terms of market advantage. I think there are some new disruptive things that we need to really put our attention on and focus our attention. So it's not about putting money all over the place to incentivize new innovations, new investments, but it's to pick where Canada can be a global leader in some areas. We have great stock to grow this from. In the life sciences, where some provinces are amazing in therapeutic areas, some in diabetes, some in cancer and oncology. There is a huge movement right now towards precision medicine, and I see that being a wave of the future. And we were talking before the panel came up, there's materials sciences that will probably be the next AI, and where is Canada going to be in this domain? And given that we have foundational elements like artificial intelligence and machine learning, that combined with robotics, you can print your pills. You know, you don't have to make a lab in the same way. So there's a whole bunch of disruption that could come along. And then the final thing I think is the rules around data and regulations are probably the preconditions that we need to have a line of sight with the most, and these are not easy things to contend with. Models around do patients give consent for their data to be released? How does collaboration work? Who owns the data? Who owns the IP? How is it held securely? How do you know who has your data? Do you need to know that, et cetera? That pathway is not one that is easily walked down. But I think the longer we wait to figure that out, the more we lose in terms of having an advantage of being a leader in this area. And Canada has so much to offer. So really, we're working extremely diligently at trying to unleash whatever we can in those few ways. I would say those are the 3.
So many more questions, but we're running a little bit out of time, and I want to make sure that we hear from you as the audience. We have some Economic Club volunteers with mics, so anybody have a burning question from the audience? Here, we have one right here from.
Thank you very much. I'm the Ambassador of Switzerland, and I, with great interest, have heard the comparison of 2 systems that, from our perspective, are pretty much alike. They're sort of state-controlled, different from ours. But that's not the question, the gist of my question. To you, sir, I hear with great interest that you have a very transparent medical data information system up and running in Denmark. We're grappling with that right now, not because it's a technical issue, but because people in Switzerland are very cautious in giving consent to sort of lining up all their medical history, because according to what has always been said, this might get into wrong hands. And wrong hands might mean that especially insurance companies might get information and then start separating people according to risk groups. That's being politically discussed back home. Is that an issue in Denmark, or would the Danes just accept that whoever within a certain framework would have access, and would the Danes not be concerned about insurances sort of grouping people in different risk groups, and for that reason charge higher premiums or even refuse to have them on?
The insurance company problem is not a problem in Denmark simply because we have this public healthcare system. Healthcare is financed through our taxes. There's 16% out of pocket, but that's nothing to do with health insurance. But you're right that there's a different culture in Denmark when it comes to sharing data. As Danes, we would rather be sure that the healthcare authorities have our data, that data are available for our industry to strengthen research and make new innovation. We would rather have that situation and then have the risk that somebody who should not access our data access them. And that's actually part of the new digital health strategy, also to work with that trust in data. And that's what differentiates Denmark from a range of countries. But I also think we have some experience in this area that could be beneficial for the authorities here in Canada on how to solve that issue, because you are perfectly right that sharing data and access to data is one of the ways to fuel innovation in healthcare, both for the authorities and for the industry. For instance, in Denmark, we also have a personalized and precision medicine strategy, and we feel we're in a good position to really embark on that strategy as an initiative from the public authorities in cooperation with our industry, because we have that data. And that is, it's not enough to have the genomic profiles. You need to have the phenotype side, which we have in Denmark.
Yeah. And actually, one of the issues that ICET has been grappling with is a little bit that data literacy among Canadians to make an informed decision along the same lines. Another question from our audience coming.
Hi, my name is Paul Hendricks. I'm with PDCI Market Access. I have a history in early innovation and commercialization in my past, and I continue to wonder about the role of large innovative companies having a headquarters or a head office in Canada, and its importance in terms of establishing an innovative culture, the high income, high intellectual roles that come with those organizations, and how they can feed the small innovative companies. And I'd be curious about your comments on that, reflecting as well in terms of your current challenges from a PMPRB perspective and changes in the attractiveness of investment in Canada.
Yeah, thank you for the question. And I think when we think about companies that are trying to establish themselves in Canada in the innovative biopharmaceutical space, it has to start by having the right talent. And I'm sure Cheryl can give you all kinds of case studies of people who have fantastic intellectual property. They have these great scientists, but how do you now make this into a commercial entity? So being able to have, you could say, large operations from global multinational companies operating in Canada, number one, creates a source of talent. And I think that that's been identified as one of the single biggest challenges in terms of how do we create these big entities in Canada? Do we have the sufficient skill set in order to commercialize? First off, Canadians travel really, really well. I mean, I spent 11 years outside of Canada, and I tend to be kind of a net exporter of Canadians to our global headquarters. And I think there's just something about our multicultural upbringing and our kind of curiosity that makes us really great ambassadors around the world. And I think now is a beautiful time to be repatriating Canadians and to bring Canadians back, and to also ensure that we continue to have multinational companies that are able to operate and ideally expand within Canada, so we can create that source of talent to be able to help these entities eventually commercialize. I've been working a lot with the mayor of Mississauga, as an example, Bonnie Crombie, who really wants to position the city of Mississauga as not the place where discovery happens. That's going to happen more in Mars and downtown Toronto and Montreal and Vancouver. But really, this is the place that maybe you can go for the talent to help commercialize, and that you have these large multinational companies that have the experience of how to take something all the way through a development process. So If we're in a situation where we are going to decrease our footprint, we're going to decrease investment, and we're going to move away from Canada being a tier 1 launch country because we want to prioritize other things and we want to kind of have a much more restrictive pricing policy, that's a decision that we can make, but there has to be awareness of the downstream consequences that go along with it, and that would certainly be one of them.
If I may comment, I mentioned the life science growth plan in Denmark, and the commercial side of that is a lot of initiatives, actually 36, many of them involving close public-private cooperation with the industry. It was interesting to hear what you said about the same focus on improving the conditions from the industry, but the Danish experience is that you really need to work in much more public-private cooperation than just having clusters. For instance, in Denmark, we have a public-private partnership called NEXT, which is an enforced entry to research between the industry, large and small companies, connecting the hospitals and researchers with the company. You need to work with it that way. If you compare to Sweden, they're not growing the life science industry the same way as we are. And I think it has something to do with this growth plan and even establish a life science office in our Ministry of Business. That's what it takes to grow the industry in my perspective.
Can I add a little something to this?
Yeah, absolutely.
Another question, Mr. Bryan. So when I first took my job, I quickly realized that we measure very, very poorly what actually happens on the ground in Canada in many sectors, but in life sciences in particular. And indeed, the brand pharma companies have been held against a certain benchmark. It's been legislated. When I've been trying to peel back the layers, what we've been seeing and learning is that you might have large multinationals who do invest in R&D in Canada. The business model has changed in terms of how that happens. So increasingly, they're looking outside to external organizations to help them innovate. And so there's a bit more of a spread in terms of the activities happening across the country. I don't quite have the full picture yet, but it's something that we're working on in collaboration with industry to try to get a fuller picture of what's happening. Once we have a fuller picture, then we can understand how to pull the levers to better develop what is happening within Canada. How do you make something a little bit more attractive to something coming in at a university to work with a large M&E such that if they have ambition to be just their own company, that they don't necessarily get swallowed up, and that can happen, for instance. That is not always the case that companies grow to a certain point and are purchased or have to leave the country in order to realize a different level of ambition. So we're trying to uncover that a little bit. And then the other thing that we're doing, I mentioned broadly the Strategic Innovation Fund, but specifically there's one part of it we refer to colloquially as Stream 4, in which we've had a competition this summer, and we're assessing now the applications, the proposal that came forward to us. And again, that gets at the behavioral change. It's how do you get large organizations working with smaller organizations, working with academia, such that their ecosystems are created in a different way. And it's also not just about what's going on in one region in particular, but it's what's happening in Vancouver as well as Montreal, as well as Toronto, and maybe even in Halifax. So what is that national layer that can be enabled? So it's for us, it's how do you shift or disrupt some things that are happening, also understanding at the same time what's changing on the ground, and we're trying to keep up with what's changing on the ground and to push it even further.
Unfortunately, we're out of time already, and there's so much more to say. Natasha, can I invite you back to the podium? Thank you very much to our panelists.
Ilse, Brian, Hans, Cheryl, thank you so very much on behalf of the Economic Club for taking the time out of your very busy schedules to speak with us today. It's always a shame when we have to cut these conversations off, but we do have the lunch hour now, so I encourage all of you to continue the discussion over lunch. I think we can all agree that it's certainly an exciting time for Canada in the life sciences sector, but to me it's determining how and where we make our mark in the international playground. And so I think that will certainly lead to more discussions, hopefully at the Economic Club. So there's a little tidbit of information there. Hopefully we'll have some more events and continue the discussions. I'd like to thank all of you for attending today. I know that everyone has very busy schedules, so we sincerely appreciate your presence. And if you haven't done so already, please leave your business cards so you can stay abreast of all of the exciting events that the Economic Club is hosting. So I will conclude now, and I wish everyone a lovely day. Thank you very much. Thank you. You can get one with them, and then I'll get one of each.